Bill Gates, the man every government, mainstream media outlet, and elite looked up to. He spent millions on crafting the perfect image of the wonderful, wise old billionaire who publicly planned to give all of his money away.
I'm super excited that that'll be over $200 billion that we'll give away during that time period, and that we'll be able to save tens of millions of lives.
But now, that image is being recognized for what it really is, a desperate attempt to hide the true darkness laying beneath it. Recent findings in the Epstein files make the claim that he slipped STD antibiotics into his wife's food, after he himself got infected on the island. And trust me, as you'll see later on, things get so much worse. It's really that bad that he's been forced to cancel his latest public appearances. And his ex-wife Melinda, the one he publicly appeared to build his empire with, is now publicly denouncing him.
Well, let me say this. I think we're having a reckoning as a society, right? No girl should ever be put in the situation that they were put in by Epstein and what was going on with all of the various people around him. So whatever questions remain there, what I can't even begin to know all of it, those questions are for those people and for even my ex-husband. They need to answer to those things, not me.
And all it took was one unsent email to confirm something people had been theorizing about for years. Now that the truth has started to trickle out, Bill's been forced to admit to
Give your business main character energy with Mood.
these two affairs with Russian women.
In a town hall meeting with employees, Gates admitting to 2 affairs with Russian women and what he says about the photos of him in the Epstein files.
And it makes you wonder, what else has he been hiding? Whether it be him becoming the largest landowner in the US, or buying out the World Health Organization, or convincing the public that they should be locked in their homes, or presiding over the World Economic Forum, all while secretly chilling out with Jeffrey Epstein. Everything starts to become obvious about this guy when you really look at his creepy behavior subtly coming out in his pre-planned public appearances.
What did you do when you found out about his background?
Well, I've said I regretted having those dinners, and there's absolutely nothing new on that. Well, he's dead, so, in general, you always have to be careful,
It's like he's dead now, so you have to be careful. Like, what? Be careful or you'll hang yourself in jail? Is that what you're saying?
People are finally waking up to the other side of Bill Gates, the side he spent his life trying to hide from the public. And we're going to uncover in this video how deep this rabbit hole truly goes. Because first of all, Bill Gates made his fortune exploiting a hole in the software industry by building a monopoly. And once we piece this story together, everything else starts to make sense about who Bill Gates really is. As when we say monopoly, we're not joking around. When Bill Gates first took over operating systems, he secured over 80% of the market share by the late 80s. Then he used that control to muscle out the rest of the competition, packaging the 1990 OS with Microsoft Word and Excel. With this unfair advantage, they then used their own developers to make something no one else could, the most compatible software ever. By doing this, Bill Gates was able to achieve a fantasy of his, becoming one of the most powerful men in the entire world, having complete control of technology throughout the 90s, and soon enough becoming the world's richest man. This gave him contacts in high society, access to people you would never have heard of, the very people who actually pull the strings in the world. But because his rise was so rapid and so quick, he quickly became a target from the government, who decided that his monopoly had become too powerful. But they soon would quickly realize that they couldn't stop him even if they wanted to. If Bill ended up sitting in front of a table of enemies rather than friends at a Senate hearing, then that might break up his entire empire. Billions of dollars, his childhood dreams, his need for power, and cementing his legacy as the next Rockefeller were all hanging in the balance. But Bill Gates is many things, and smart is one of them, as he had a trick up his sleeve to get in the good books with the right people, and that was with philanthropy. You see, in 1994, Bill Gates was realizing his public perception was looking terrible. As he rose up with more and more power and control over the world, his billionaire status wasn't seen favorably by most. So if you're the world's richest man, one of the most powerful men in the world, what can you do to make people like you, so that people don't go investigating your personal private life? Well, that would be through founding a charity. So he created his first called the William H. Gates Foundation after his father. He used it to funnel parts of his vast fortune into philanthropy. They were tiny compared to his net worth, but still more than enough for his needs. Meanwhile, he openly defied a 1995 ruling by the Department of Justice to relinquish his new monopoly on internet browsers. But Gates knew that he could get away with this if he played his cards right, especially if he could use the charity card to his advantage, and look like he was just doing all of this work to give back to the people. Now, at first, he didn't need to save the world or feed the hungry children of Africa to influence the right people. Instead, Gates started small and close to home. Coincidentally or not, it was also a world which most of the Senate came from, the elite education system. He knew that this would not only help his public perception by looking like he was giving all of this money back to the people of his country, but he also knew he'd get the right connections by targeting the right people, which is why the William H. Gates Foundation's first work focused on scholarships, entry programs, and grants and donations to colleges. One 1998 donation of $20 million to Duke University created a program to fast-track high-performing students into the world of the elites. It was just one of many, and for the first few years, this was pretty much the only thing that the Gates Foundations even did. And we can see the reasons behind this strategy very clearly in hindsight. Elite education was where so many politicians come from, where they had built their connections and their base of power. You can be sure that they still all talked to their old friends at the colleges, and that they all kept an eye on the top of the education system. The move also played into Gates' direct interests, giving him direct access and making the top students in the country feel indebted to him and his company. By the mid-90s, people were beginning to understand that the internet was the future. It was like the AI craze today, but actually real and useful. People also understood that Bill, Microsoft, and their monopoly were perfectly situated to add to their empire. In this interview from 1996, he barely even bothered to defend it, or even push back on the accusation that he had almost complete control of the industry.
Quoted, I think, someone as saying that Microsoft will be the most powerful company in the history of business enterprise in the 21st century. Certainly the most powerful company in a long time. Do you see that?
No, I really don't. We're a company that makes tools, and Windows, it's a tool.
What's the market share of Microsoft operating systems?
Oh, it's a little hard to measure because it always depends on if you include piracy or what types of systems, but it's certainly in the 70, 80, 90% range.
Pretty good market share, I'd say.
Right. We're just a software supplier, but we're hoping to develop software.
But you want your software to run those.
If people want to buy it, to do those things, we're going to try and make it so easy to use that they find that a great decision.
It's much better position than everybody else, and you know it. Your company probably today is better positioned to do what it wants to do and realize its dreams than it's ever been at any time in its history. Better position.
Of course, Bill knew this as well. He was already 3 steps ahead, ensuring he had the right connections and had put the money in the right pockets. So when Gates finally had his Senate hearing, his net worth had risen from around $10 billion to over $46 billion in just 3 years. Articles at the time seemed hopeful that they might see him brought down a peg or two, but nobody really knew if the government had the power to deal with the new richest man in the world. At this point, though, Bill was already beginning to indulge in a different side of his life, one that must have been far more interesting than his monopoly problems and potentially more dangerous to his reputation. You see, Bill Gates was a nerdy guy when he was young. He clearly wasn't your classical ladies man, and he'd pretty much sacrificed everything for business. Throughout, he really stuck with just one woman, the woman he'd built his empire with. He'd been married to Melinda Gates since 1994, but their relationship began in the workplace all the way back in 1987. Melinda had been hired as an engineer at Microsoft, where she met Bill, her boss. The two then started an ethically dubious relationship, one that certainly wouldn't be seen as okay by today's standards. But at the time, they were happy, and there was little resistance to this. And once they were married, they projected the image of a perfect, happy marriage to the world. It was all perfect for Bill's reputation as the nice, wise, nerdy rich guy. Then in the late 90s, when Bill Gates had to change his public image, Bill realized that he could use his marriage as the perfect front for a charity. And this is when they co-founded the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, which turned their local charity work into a global business. Behind the scenes, though, it was quite different, and Bill started to get set up to the same tricks again. In 2000, Bill Gates became involved with yet another engineer at his company, who remains anonymous to this day. He was still the CEO at this point, but it didn't stop him from starting an affair which reportedly went on for years. And annoyingly, there's this real sense of arrogance with which Bill Gates carries himself. All the evidence that we'll see paints a picture of a man who was often forward with other women, despite his perfect, happy married front, and who might have actually been pursuing affairs for years. In a later interview from 2022, when everything started unraveling, his apologies just ring very hollow.
Did that happen? Were you unfaithful in your marriage? Is that one of the reasons there was a divorce?
I certainly made mistakes, and I take responsibility. I don't think delving into the particulars at this point is constructive, but yes, I caused pain, and I feel terrible about that.
Yes, he takes responsibility, but he also doesn't want to talk about any of the things he did specifically. Then later, they ask him about Epstein, and he says this.
Why did you continue to meet with him when you met him? He was already a convicted sex offender. Do you regret that?
I certainly made a huge mistake, not only meeting him in the first place, but I met with him a number of times.
Gates is using charity to justify what he did and the company he kept. He could have found some way of applying the same logic to his affairs, and you can be sure he would have done that as well. Of course, people at Microsoft knew all about these claims and who Bill really was. Everyone knew his power, and his company's power was getting out of control as well. But nobody's ever wanted to rock the boat and expose him. One, his image in the public consciousness was seemingly insurmountable, and two, he was also one of the most powerful men in America. He was someone who had opinion pieces in the biggest newspapers talking about the massive amounts of money he was giving away. Gates and his foundation weren't like the other charities at the time, though. Gates was pioneering a specific kind of charity now known as philanthrocapitalism. As an ideology, it combines charity with economics and business strategy. Traditional charity focused on immediate solutions, give food to the hungry, water to the thirsty, and jobs to the poor. But as the century turned, this kind of charity was losing funding. Then when the war on terror began, the Western government's bankrolling things suddenly tightened their purse strings. So in came Gates and other philanthrocapitalists to fill the gap. But instead of following the traditional methods, they wanted to run things differently, like a company. They began taking direct control of investments rather than giving out aid, focusing on data collection and reshaping overall policies at the government's level. With their grip on the money, they were controlling who got the funds and how they were used, which effectively put them in control of their partners abroad, allowing them to subtly change the directions of their policies with the implicit threat of turning off the flow of aid money, which so many people now relied on to live. Meanwhile, this idea of performative charity became the Gates Manifesto. He talked about it whenever he could. In 2007, Gates was invited to address Harvard at one of their student events, and his speech laid out the framework that he would rely on for the next 20 years.
You can make market forces work better for the poor if we can develop a more creative capitalism. If we can find approaches that meet the needs of the poor in ways that generate profits for business and votes for politicians, we will have found a sustainable way to reduce inequity in the world.
Gates lays it out here plain and simple. His goal was to treat charity like capitalism and use that influence to pressure governments. He accomplished this with his network of elites like the former president of Harvard, who has recently been forced to resign due to his own links with Epstein.
Former Harvard President Larry Summers will resign from his academic and faculty roles at the university at the end of the academic year. This is all over his ties to Jeffrey Epstein.
He later admitted slightly more of the truth, but only things the evidence had all but confirmed already. Quote, I did have affairs, one with a Russian bridge player who met me at bridge events, and one with a Russian nuclear physicist who I met through business activities, he reportedly said to colleagues. Because there's only so much you can do as a billionaire. You can buy all of the things in the world and influence the economy, but you can't fully control the government. But with charity, you can become more powerful than often even presidents. Of course, he said this was all just for making people's lives better, but how much better does the world really seem a few decades under the shadowy rule of the billionaire class? Doesn't it feel like things have actually gotten a whole lot worse in nearly every way for regular people? It hasn't always been beneficial for the voiceless people that Gates says he champions either. Despite billions of dollars in investments and their programs for African farmers to use Gates Foundation-sponsored GMO seeds and crops, the results are pretty terrible. Not only does this come across like Bill Gates is trying to neo-colonialize Africa, but it's a pretty worrying precedent for what was to come. You see, most of the world has gotten far better at farming, technology has improved, and we're just more efficient. But agricultural production in Africa, where Gates puts most of his focus, has actually dropped by 10% between the mid-20th century and the early 2000s. Critics claim this is because Gates and other philanthrocapitalists sponsored people to farm single crops for the export market. These kinds of farms are weaker than varied ones. They're heavily dependent on volatile global markets for their chosen crop, and they're much worse when it comes to feeding people. The benefits to Gates, though, were obvious. He gets to influence public policy around the world, and he gets to write it all off and pay less tax, effectively meaning that taxpayers are subsidizing all of this. But the best part of this kind of charity work is the publicity it gives him. A steady stream of newspaper reports and TV spots about his charity work legitimized his place at the top, and made it that much harder for his alleged victims to speak out. People who would appear in the Epstein files years later, standing arm in arm with Bill Gates and with their faces blacked out to protect their identities. This was also a strategy that a different billionaire philanthropist used to cultivate an image. When he was alive and active in high society, Jeffrey Epstein used his charity as a shield and a way to justify his lifestyle, while also using it to network, connect with the most powerful people in high society, and likely manipulating them for compromise. In reality, we now know that his charity barely gave any actual money to needy causes compared to his vast wealth. In 18 years, they only donated under $17 million to charity compared to his much, much faster fortune. Charity was purely a way of buying leverage and influence over the most powerful people. But on paper, it looks much larger. There's even evidence that Epstein edited his own Wikipedia pages to add much larger figures. One 2013 edit claimed he donated $184 million more than he actually had. The account that made this edit has the same username he had claimed in his earlier court documents. By this point, Epstein and Gates had both been active in the charity world for years, both realizing its lucrative potential. It was also how Epstein first met Bill in 2011. This was just 3 years after Epstein had been convicted for procuring a child as a prostitute, and Bill had been warned about his inappropriate behavior at work. The New York Times alleges that, based on numerous documents from both the Epstein files and the Gates Foundation, Bill visited Epstein's Manhattan townhouse. On one occasion, he stayed late into the night and remarked in emails to colleagues that his lifestyle was very different and kind of intriguing, although it would not work for me. Although it was later revealed that there was a framed $1 bill signed with a handwritten note from Bill Gates on display in Epstein's townhouse, saying, quote, I was wrong. Later on, a spokesperson for Gates said that the quote about it not working for me was actually just referring to the decor. But in an email from the time, he said, quote, a very attractive Swedish woman and her daughter dropped by, and I ended up staying there quite late. It doesn't sound like he was only admiring the curtains and the armchairs when he visited, and it seemed to contradict this interview he gave in 2026.
It's actually true that I was only at dinners. I never went to the island. I never met any women. And so, the more that comes out, the more clear it'll be that, although the time was a mistake, it had nothing to do with that kind of behavior.
And also, why was there this $1 bill signed personally by him in Epstein's mansion? He also did in fact meet women. We have photo evidence in the Epstein files that he did. Whether or not he did any more than meet them is still an allegation rather than a fact, but we know he was there. The photos show Gates standing close to 2 women, both of which have had their faces blacked out. And according to the FBI, all of the redactions to the Epstein files have been made to protect the identities of the victims. So it leaves it all up in the air. Were these people victims, and was it Bill Gates who was the victimizer? Gates and Epstein also had intimate business connections. They were both linked by JP Morgan. In 2011, Gates was in the process of creating an investment fund with them to assist in his vaccine rollout across the developing world. Another way he increased his soft power. Epstein, meanwhile, often brought them wealthy clients while also banking part of his immense fortune with them. The most shocking revelations, though, ones which probably led Gates to accounts of his recent public appearance are potentially much more damaging and could lead to a criminal investigation if proven correct. But remember, Bill Gates has literally spent a lifetime cultivating the kind of soft power that insulates him from the kinds of consequences that regular people might get for their crimes. Since the forming of his foundation in the late 90s, Gates has always targeted the things that people need the most. Healthcare is what he'll always talk about, but farmland is another obsession of his, and he keeps that far more quiet, especially when it comes to his domestic holdings. With about 250,000 acres, an area that's nearly the same size as Hong Kong, Gates is the #1 private owner of farmland in the US. He can test out his GMO crops on this farmland, run his own experiments, and control a sizable portion of the agricultural industry, just by using a remarkably small portion of his overall wealth. Meanwhile, he's still making money with all of the leases. Really though, this is still all about the image and access it gives him to power. First, it gives him a legitimate reason to intervene or be consulted on major policy decisions when it comes to agriculture. Plus, owning land has always been a traditional source of power and respect in the world. It's the definition of a finite resource, one that will always go up in value as more people are born. Gates made sure that he had reach in a wide array of government interests, especially in vaccines. This was the foundation's key interest in developing countries throughout the 2010s, pushing massive programs which administered vaccines across the developing world. Continually pushing this as their #1 goal gave Bill Gates and his foundation immense power within the wider healthcare world. They're also the second biggest funder of the World Health Organization. The Gates Foundation decides what they do with the money they give them, and in 2018 to 2019, they gave over $500 million to the World Health Organization. When the pandemic happened, something that Gates had actually predicted years before in a TED Talk, he immediately rushed to capitalize on this, giving interviews with an air of "I told you so," while trying to legitimize his place as a world leader on the response.
It's the nightmare that we've been talking about for a long time, and sadly, although a few things like this coalition for vaccines, CEPI, were done after 2015, a very small percentage of what we should have done, where we would have diagnostics very quickly, drugs very quickly, and a vaccine far more rapidly.
Meanwhile, he used his position to gain even more power in governments across the world, all as a completely undemocratic, unelected billionaire official, where he would pioneer government lockdowns and the complete erosion of freedom throughout the West for years. In addition, this also gave him loads of meetings with world leaders, as well as almost unchecked power to decide where the vaccine rollout happened and who got the doses in the developing world. They also advised the US and other Western nations on their own responses. But in particular, he advised the US and all these other Western nations on the waves of lockdowns and various measures that governments took, effective or otherwise, all without any repercussions later on, even though in hindsight we know how catastrophic these actions really were. Meanwhile, the world's 10 richest men doubled their net worths over the course of the pandemic. This closeness to power gave something money couldn't for Bill Gates. It gave him yet more insulation against the chaos of his own dark private life. In 2019, the first Epstein allegations began to emerge about Gates. His private life began to fall apart, and his wife began divorce proceedings, but in the public eye, he was still untouchable. The idea that he could have too much power was decried as a conspiracy theory. You would have seen as a crackpot for even talking out about this guy. He was still seen as one of the most respected billionaires out there. His perfect image he'd spent decades working on had really done wonders. People were looking up to him as this wise elderly figure. But then that same year, small cracks began to emerge. Microsoft then learned of the affair he had started in the year 2000. He had left the CEO position long ago, but it seems like this was the final push that got him off their board altogether. Although Gates does deny this himself. In 2021, the divorce then became public, and more Epstein details emerged, like the pictures of Gates with a woman and the evidence that he had once been a passenger on Epstein's private plane. It sounded a lot more than the charity dinners that Gates claims were their own contacts.
I had dinners with him. He had relationships with people he said, would give to global health, which is an interest I have. Not nearly enough philanthropy goes in that direction.
But most importantly, it brings us to the present and the most recent allegations made against Gates. The details are key. In a set of unsent draft emails, Epstein writes an account of the dirty secrets behind their time together. He writes in the voice of the right-hand man of Bill Gates. Then he goes on to describe their activities. The details are key. In a set of unsent draft emails, Epstein writes an account of the dirty secrets behind their time together. He writes in the voice of the right-hand man of Bill Gates. Then he goes on to describe their activities. From helping Bill to get drugs in order to deal with the consequences of sex with Russian girls, to facilitating his illicit trysts with married women, to being asked to provide Adderall for bridge tournaments. Epstein often wrote messages like this, perhaps to record potential blackmail and compromise material on his rich connections, although there was no evidence released alongside the email draft. Some of what he says, though, about the affairs at least, and Bill's specific proclivities towards that can be corroborated. Numerous women have also described having to turn down Bill at various work and charity events after he made inappropriate advances. But this is all just speculation, though. Bill has thoroughly denied the accusations, of course. Melinda Gates, on the other hand, seemed to wash her hands of it in this interview.
Unexpected, beautiful place in my life. So whatever questions remain there of what I can't even begin to know all of it, those questions are for those people and for even my ex-husband. They need to answer those things, not me. And I'm so happy to be away from all the muck.
She was a part of that world for many decades, and like other elites, she isn't going to say anything of substance about her own personal experiences. In February of 2026, shortly after these allegations emerged, Gates cancelled an appearance at an AI summit, and it was the first step on his inevitable path of public disgrace. But it's still light years away from any actual consequences. So far, despite the massive amounts of evidence of a wide-reaching conspiracy, we've only really seen one arrest in the fallout of the Epstein files. The scapegoat chosen was former Prince Andrew, and he's been the only elite to suffer any real penalties. And it isn't even related to trafficking at all. Instead, it's like a pathetic version of Al Capone getting locked away for tax evasion instead. It is, hopefully though, the first domino of many. The people at the top with the power to change things refuse to acknowledge the elephant in the room. The most likely outcome if the outrage continues is that we will continue to see these kinds of symbolic things. Elite perpetrators facing comparatively minor consequences without any true acknowledgement of the actual crimes they allegedly committed. If the momentum continues, then people like Bill Gates might actually get investigated for once. But until then, though, we might just have to settle for them losing their reputation instead of their freedom. It's still a massive loss for someone with almost unlimited wealth, as clearly even with all the best PR team and all the money in the world, you simply can't buy your way back from that level of disgrace.